Welcome, everyone, to one of our Thursdays at 3 talks. It's so nice to see all of you here. It is our pleasure to introduce Eileen Botting to the Rare Books Division. So, as many of you know, we hold a lot of events in the Rare Books Division. But it's somewhat unique, I think, to host a talk that not only speaks to our holdings in the Rare Books Division, but also directly points to material that right now is so readily accessible to the public. So Hannah Mather Crocker's Observation on the Real Rights of Women, published in Boston in 1818, the first book on women's rights published by an American, can be accessed in its entirety on the library's website. That's very exciting, right? And in many ways, this liberates the text, right, both sort of figuratively and literally, from its archival boundaries, right? And making it freely available to that next generation of feminist philosophers, right? And that's very exciting. So appropriately, today, we're going to be talking about those questions of reception and influence, right? Of the long and complex and sometimes controversial history that comes along with the history of women's rights. Professor Botting is here to talk about all of this today, and I can honestly think of no one who is better suited for this talk. Dr. Botting is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Her many publications reflect her profound commitment to using the history of political science to engage questions, important questions, of human rights, of women's rights, of children's rights. And so her books include Mary Shelley and the Rights of the Child, Political Philosophy in Frankenstein from 2017, Wollstonecraft, Mill, and Women's Human Rights, 2016, Family Feuds, Wollstonecraft, Burke, and Rousseau in the Transformation of the Family from 2007. Dr. Botting also has written an intimidating amount of articles and book chapters, and if I may, my favorite is from the Journal of International Political Theory from 2016. Women's human rights may be unicorns, but they can fight wicked witches. So several of these articles have won prestigious awards from institutions such as the Society for the Study of American Women Writers and the O'Keen Young Award in Feminist Political Theory. So again, we are delighted to have her here with us today. So please help me to officially welcome Dr. Eileen Botting to speak on why Hannah Mather Crocker's observation on the real rights of women matters at 200. Wanted to see how good you were.
So, the topic of my talk is why Crocker's observations on the real rights of women matters at 200. And to answer this question, I think I need to tell you a little bit about why I came to study Hannah Mather Crocker and why she's come to matter so much to me as a scholar of feminism in America. I became interested in the American tradition of women's rights advocacy in graduate school. At Yale University, where I was studying for my PhD in political science with my good friend and colleague, Colleen Shogan of the Library of Congress. Professor Roger Smith of the Yale Department of Political Science taught a course on American political thought, in which we read women's rights advocates like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the Grimke sisters, Catherine Beecher, and so on. And I was struck by how these women made arguments strikingly similar to Mary Wollstonecraft, who is the topic of my dissertation. Mary Wollstonecraft, as you know, was an Anglo-Irish women's rights advocate from London, who had published the first internationally renowned treatise on women's rights in 1792, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So after I had completed my dissertation on Wollstonecraft, Burke, and Rousseau's theories of the family, I moved on to study the question of Wollstonecraft's philosophical impact in the United States. And among those women that I discovered were pupils of Wollstonecraft, to use a phrase coined by Abigail Adams, no less, were women like Judith Sargent Murray, who wrote a very early essay on women's equality to men. That was published in her Gleaner of 1798, and also Hannah Mather Crocker, who published the first book-length philosophical treatise on women's rights in 1818 in Boston. I was shocked to learn that the author of America's first book or treatise on women's rights was almost unknown, even in feminist scholarship. In fact, one of the only scholars to have highlighted Crocker's achievement was Roger Smith in his 1997 book, Civic Ideals. So who was Hannah Mather Crocker? She was born in 1752 near North Square in Boston's North End neighborhood. Her family home on Moon Court was around the corner from Paul Revere's house and the Second Church of Boston. So if you've been to the Paul Revere house, you're in her neck of the woods. The Second Church of Boston no longer exists, but there's a placard in the square there that you can see. And this was the Congregationalist church of her forefathers, Increase and Cotton Mather, who are pictured here. She identified as the fifth generation of Congregationalist clerics and political leaders born of the American branch of the Mather family. She gave to the American Antiquarian Society in 1815 an infant's high chair, pictured here. She claimed that 7 generations of the Mather family had sat in it, beginning with Richard Mather, the father of Increase Mather. But later scholarship has shown that the chair was likely made in America, not England, in the 17th century. So it is more likely that 5 generations, only 5, of Mathers and Crockers, beginning with Increase's son Cotton, pictured in center here, sat in the chair from the late 17th century through the early 19th century. Crocker bore 10 children to Joseph Crocker, a Revolutionary War veteran, and 7 lived to adulthood. Some of her grandchildren, she wrote in her unpublished reminiscences in the 1820s, sat in the Mather High Chair before she gave it to the American Antiquarian Society. So it's quite a touching art object for her to symbolically bestow to the AAS, which at the time, as you know, was an all-male society. So it takes on even deeper symbolic feminist resonance when we think about her as a woman, as a mother, giving over this art object that represents at least 5 generations of her family. Now, Crocker's mother was a Hutchinson. She was the sister of the royal governor of Massachusetts in the run-up to the American Revolution. He's pictured here. And so Crocker had loyalist ties through that wing of the family, the Hutchinson wing. But her father was a Mather, the son of Cotton Mather, the famed Puritan minister, and Samuel Mather, her father, was a strong supporter of the revolutionary cause. Crocker's own political sympathies were squarely on the side of the revolutionary patriots. In her Reminiscences and Traditions of Boston, which I co-edited and published with my former graduate student Sarah L. Hauser in 2011, she describes herself as a revolutionary patriot, smuggling papers across the Charles River from her father to General Joseph Warren, pictured here. Joseph Warren was a Revolutionary War hero who would die in the Battle of Bunker Hill. The next morning, after Crocker supposedly delivered these papers on behalf of her father. Now, this story may have been inflated for effect by the elderly Crocker, who wrote her reminiscences in the 1820s when she was in her 60s. But the symbolic point of this story is clear. Crocker wishes to represent women of the revolutionary generation as more than capable of taking up the tasks of Republican citizenship, including putting their safety on the line for the sake of preserving the flame of liberty that had swept over the American colonies after enduring the increasingly oppressive and unfair trade and taxation policies of the British since the mid-18th century. Crocker consistently represented herself and other women as capable and deserving of citizenship. She also suggested, in sometimes subtle prose, that to deny women's full citizenship was to render illegitimate the American Republic and its roots in the revolutionary struggle for equal rights and liberty for each and all. Raised a Congregationalist, Crocker viewed all souls as equal and made in the image of their rational God, whose universal and rational moral law they were obliged to follow. On the title page of the Observations, she used a quote from Genesis 2:23 as a biblical paratext to frame her argument for the rights of women. And I quote, "And God saw it was not good for man to be alone, and he made him an helpmeet for him. And Adam said, she is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Therefore, she shall be called woman." This view of woman as made by God to be the helpmeet of man might look, at first glance, as patriarchal. But over the course of the Observations, as well as her other writings, Crocker emphasizes that man and woman are meant to be friends and companions to one another, for they are both made in the image of God and share most of the same characteristics, including the basic building blocks of the body, bones and flesh, as well as the God-given reason to read the scriptures and understand the divine moral commandments that apply to both of them. Her father, Samuel Mather, was dismissed from the Second Church of Boston and founded a new Congregationalist church, the Mather Meeting House, that eventually became the home of the Universalist Church in Boston. His theological views were more in the rationalist vein than the evangelical vein that was sweeping Boston in the run-up to the Revolution. I think that Crocker's own unique theology, which she preserved in manuscripts now housed in the American Antiquarian Society, was deeply influenced by her father's rationalism, as well as her affiliation with the Masonic movement in Boston. Crocker was involved in founding the first female lodge for women in Boston, if not in the United States, St. Anne's Lodge. Not much is known about this female Masonic lodge beyond her publication of several poems concerning its activities and ideals in Boston newspapers in the 1780s and 1790s. I was able to confirm her publication of these poems through examination of the contents of the appendix of her reminiscences and comparing these poems preserved there in manuscript form with those published in Boston newspapers and now preserved on microfilm. The spirit of St. Anne's Lodge was one of educating women to understand and believe in one another's fundamental moral and intellectual equality as creatures made in the image of God. The lodge met to read works and science and literature. Blending biblical and Masonic language and ideas, the lodge produced a feminist creed, the North Square Creed, for the husbands of the women in the group. Preserved in the reminiscences, as well as in the American Antiquarian Society, the creed provides the helpful feminist commentary on the biblical concept of the helpmeet that makes sense of the paratext from Genesis on the title page of the Observations. So I'll read the creed now. I believe woman is the ostensible source of man's happiness. I believe it was not good for man to be alone, and God in infinite mercy provided him a helpmeet. I believe a prudent wife is the greatest blessing man can obtain in this life. I also believe every man that has a prudent wife ought to hearken to the voice of his prudent wife, as I firmly believe no good and prudent woman will ever lead her husband astray. And I do verily believe that every man that has a prudent wife has a blessing from the Lord. Therefore, I do believe in all things as my best friend and my wife and the other ladies of this happy circle wishes to believe. In token of approbation, we unite in here to affix our names Among the initials is JC, which I and Sarah Hauser take to be Joseph Crocker, Crocker's husband. The creed is drawn by Prudentia. Prudentia is one of Crocker's staple nicknames, and she often wrote under that pseudonym, even in her manuscripts. So she clearly thought of the name Prudentia as symbolic of her character, as a model of women's prudential reason and good judgment. Now, the creed suggests that the husbands of the women in the lodge pledge to honor and obey their wives in every aspect of their lives, showing the lodge's commitment to the empowerment of women from within marriage and family, and extending outward to women's roles in society and education more broadly. So I take this to be a creed written by women, and probably written in particular by Hannah Mather Crocker, for the men whose wives were in the lodge, to signify their support of their education within the Masonic culture, but also to just more broadly affirm their support of their wives in every aspect of life, beginning in the family and extending out to society at large. Together with Sarah Hauser, I argued in a 2006 article in the American Political Science Review that Crocker, like many women of the early 19th century, used rhetorical strategies to subtly and cleverly engage the controversial question of women's rights in the post-revolutionary era. In the Napoleonic era, both in the United States and in Europe, the question of women's rights was often run underground. And it lacked the highly visible public profile it had enjoyed in the heady days of the American and French revolutions. For this reason, women had to engage in covert rhetorical strategies to engage the question of women's rights during the first 2 decades of the 19th century. One example of a rhetorical strategy that Crocker used was her apparent claim in the Observations that women should not ascend the rostrum to make public speeches. So let me read this quote from chapter 2 of the Observations, and then we can parse it to look at its complicated language. She says, "There can be no doubt that, in most cases, their, women's, judgment may be equal with the other sex, perhaps even on the subject of law, politics, or religion. They may form good judgment, but it would be morally improper and physically very incorrect for the female character to claim the statesman's birth or ascend the rostrum to gain the loud applause of men, although their powers of mind may be equal to the task." So, although it looks at face value that she's prohibiting women's ascent to the rostrum, ascent to a position such as this, at a podium, to make a public speech, when you read closer, her language reveals itself to be very ambiguous. It seems that she's not so much claiming that women should not make public speeches, but that women are constrained to some degree by norms of feminine propriety with regard to their public political actions, including speech. In addition, when we read this passage in light of Crocker's own preservation of manuscripts of sermons and other speeches that she gave in the 1810s to support the founding of a school for poor girls in the North End of Boston and to protest the injustice of the War of 1812, then we see that Crocker did not object to women's public speaking per se, but rather modeled through her writing and other political actions, including her gifts of manuscripts to public repositories, a woman could and should strategically deploy speech and other political actions in relation to sometimes oppressive norms of femininity, paradoxically capitalizing on those norms by subtly subverting them through brave and smart acts of public resistance to gender-based oppression. Crocker advocated for equal educational opportunities for men and women, beginning in childhood. She liked Wollstonecraft's views on education, but was not as committed to co-education or public education as the primary means for realizing the full range of educational opportunities for women. Crocker emphasized the need for the content, but not necessarily the form of education to be the same for girls and boys for the sake of advancing gender equality. To get a sense of the range of educational forms she supported, we can look at her life. She was homeschooled amidst the famed Mather family library, now housed in the American Antiquarian Society. She praised her friend, the freed slave and African-American poetess Phyllis Wheatley, as a largely self-taught prodigy and poetic genius. She helped found a vocational school for poor girls in 1813, which closed in 1819, in part due to the rise of public schools in Boston that could fulfill the same purpose, but in a more comprehensive manner. There was no record of her or the other women involved in the founding of the school for poor girls, opposing its closure or the growth of public schooling in Boston. It seems Crocker was fine with religious and secular, public and private, coeducational and single-sex forms of education for children, as long as the genders, classes, and races had equal access to high-quality educational content with a focus on science and literature. So, why do the observations matter at 200? I have 5 reasons. First, I'd like to make a case that it is, in fact, the first book-length philosophical treatise on women's rights published by an American. We had a symposium at the Massachusetts Historical Society as part of the American Political Science Association meeting in September, in which we had a number of scholars of Crocker and some scholars more generally of American history and literature taking part. And some of my colleagues expressed some skepticism about this claim. I mean, is the observations truly a treatise? That was one question that someone asked. I believe so. It is organized in the form of a treatise in the sense that it is separated into discrete chapters focused on particular philosophical, theological, and historical topics. It builds to a conclusion, and although it branches the fields of history, philosophy, and literature, as well as theology, it, to me, represents a coherent philosophical argument made over the space of roughly 100 pages. If that doesn't qualify for a treatise, I don't know what does. Now, I think that in contemporary literary terms, we might understand it as a hybrid text. Okay, so in contemporary literary theory, we call a hybrid text something that perhaps bridges autobiography and philosophy, or creative writing and history. This is a very popular form of writing today. Crocker most definitely bridged the feminine genres of the late 18th and early 19th century of the literary miscellany, women's history, and family genealogy, for sure. But she blended those traditional feminine genres and modes of writing with traditional masculine genres and modes of writing. And those would be the philosophical treatise or argument, the theological treatise and argument, and the political treatise, which was probably the most masculine form of writing at that time. So keep in mind how bold it was for Mary Wollstonecraft to publish her first political treatise in 1790, A Vindication of the Rights of Men. Wollstonecraft published that first reply to Burke in his Reflections on the Revolution in France anonymously. And no one guessed it was a woman. No one believed it could be a woman. Right. That's how bold it was for her to write, use the form of a political treatise to reply to Burke, one of the elder statesmen of the time. So for Crocker to take this form, right, of the political treatise in 1818, right, just 3 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in a time of repression on the issue of women's rights on both sides of the Atlantic, and to make an extended argument for women's rights in that form is radical, even if much of her language appears conservative and appears to be a step backward from Enlightenment era ideals of women's rights that Wollstonecraft advocated for example. I think when we read the treatise more closely, we find that Crocker largely is in agreement with Wollstonecraft, who she actually praises at one point in the Observations. So I would like to make a scholarly case at some point that we should understand the publication of the Observations as significant politically as Wollstonecraft's publication of the Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790. The second reason I'd like to argue that the Observations matter at 200 is Crocker's use of the text to defend not solely republicanism, but a feminist form of republicanism. So in chapter 7 of the Observations, Crocker follows Mary Wollstonecraft by explicitly venturing into the political theory of republicanism. Those of you who are familiar with Wollstonecraft's work know that in her History of the French Revolution, Wollstonecraft explicitly identified herself as a political scientist. In chapter 6 of the Observations, Crocker explicitly identifies herself as a philosopher. And she takes up the philosophical and political question of what makes a legitimate state. And like Wollstonecraft, she agrees that a legitimate state must be republican. Crocker argues in chapter 7 that legitimate government requires women the right of mutual judgment alongside men, joining with the other sex in every prudent measure for their mutual defense and safety. Republicanism also requires free discussion of sentiments across all classes of the citizens. But she doesn't stop there. The Observations do not merely advocate for republicanism, as male revolutionary leaders, such as Jefferson and Lafayette, had done for decades. But the Observations go further. They argue for a need of a feminist form of republicanism. Her model for a legitimate American republic is a happy and equal marriage. The state must be constituted in terms of the equality of its partners in the citizenry, animated by mutual respect, input, and deliberation about matters of common concern. Just like in an ideal marriage, the partners would have equal say and input, and the husbands would respect the wives, as the North Square Creed implored them to do. So she writes in the Observations, "Love is the sacred bond of mutual friendship and promotes a reciprocal intercourse of kind affection." I think this is a really striking passage, and a number of us at the Massachusetts Historical Society panel noted the way in which the Observations continually returns to the importance of the values of love, peace, and friendship. And that this actually provides a nice antidote to the kind of hostile political climate we find ourselves in, especially with regard to feminist ideas today in the United States. In the age of Me Too, it does seem as though Crocker's understanding of love as the sacred bond of mutual friendship is instructive. Friendship between men and women is the basis of a just and peaceful society. While naming violence as critical, as she did herself in the Reminiscences when she exposed Phyllis Wheatley's husband was abusive and a likely reason for her untimely death. Crocker also envisioned and practiced how friendship across differences is the way forward. So while we must name and identify violence and injustice, we can't stop there. We actually have to build bridges and create peace in relationships of friendship in order to achieve justice in the future. Domestic tranquility and peace are part of a legitimate republic as much as a loving and egalitarian marriage based on friendship. Crocker, though an ardent supporter of the American Revolution, represented herself as a nonviolent messenger for the Patriots when she smuggled papers from her father to Joseph Warren. Her point, even in this story, was the value of peace and love over war and conflict. In one version of the story that circulated in anecdote form in early 19th century Boston, Warren gave her a chaste and friendly kiss before he said, "I'll see you tomorrow." Of course, the tragedy was that he died the next day in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I think this story has great symbolic resonance for Crocker because I think she wants to hold up Joseph Warren and herself as a model of a kind of civic friendship between male and female equals. It wasn't a romantic relationship. She was already engaged to Joseph, but they had a kind of deep respect for one another as fellow civic actors. And so the chaste kiss represents that equality and friendship between them. In the 1810s, she protested the War of 1812 through humorous poetry, and she used the pen name the Widow Pigsley, and argued with satirical political verse that she should not have to pay taxes to support an unjust imperial war against the poor Canadians. And her observations likewise preach peace and love to cancel out past conflict between the sexes, and argue that only once peace reigns in the family will it reign across the whole republic. The next reason why I think the observations matter at 200 is that Crocker gives us a model for theorizing rights alongside duties. So the title of the observations is quite long, Observations on the Real Rights of Women with Their Appropriate Duties, Agreeable to Scripture, Reason, and Common Sense. And I think it's really important that she pairs real rights alongside appropriate duties. And by pairing rights and duties, she actually followed both Burke and Wollstonecraft. Her language of real rights probably was drawn from Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, where he contrasted the real rights grounded in human needs with the abstract rights of the principles of the French revolutionaries. Now, although she takes the term real rights from Burke, she puts a Wollstonecraftian twist on it. Like Wollstonecraft, she understands rights as moral correlates of fundamental duties prescribed by the universal rational law of God. For Crocker and Wollstonecraft, the real rights of women are grounded on the absolutely firm foundation of God's rational moral law and must be practiced in tandem with their appropriate moral duties. Crocker, however, relies much more heavily on Christian scripture to justify this moral framework than does Wollstonecraft. Now, in a time of skepticism about liberals and liberalism, the emptiness of rights talk, the futility of liberalism, and speculation about the end of the republic itself, we need recourse to a deeper and richer vocabulary of rights and duties that Crocker provides in the observations. 30 years ago, the Kantian feminist philosopher Honora O'Neill called for a declaration of duties to fend off the threat of the emptiness of rights talk. In other words, O'Neill, like Crocker, thought every time we mention a right, we ought to be conceptualizing that right in relationship to a fundamental duty. Paying respect to Crocker's argumentative approach to women's rights may pay dividends for contemporary feminists, especially in the US, where Christian religion is a huge part of the political landscape. We may need more reference to real rights, grounded in a sense of duty to serve and help one another in times of crisis and need. Crocker wrote in the observations, "Love is the life and soul of every relative duty. Furthermore, the surest foundation to secure the female's right must be in family government, as without that, woman can have no established right." Throughout the book, she speaks of the importance of maintaining sexual equality in both religious practice and education in the home, in the old tradition of the Puritans. Gender equality begins not only with the family, but with its religious practices and beliefs, then extends outward to permeate the whole free federal republic. The fourth reason why I think the observation matters at 200 is somewhat paradoxical. And that's because I think Crocker is something of a specter in the history of feminism. She's haunted the history of feminism in the US without ever regaining a real place in the canon. Harriet Robinson and Elizabeth Cady Stanton dismissed her in their 1880s histories of the women's rights and suffrage movements because she was too conservative or subtle in her presentation of her views. They viewed her as a step backwards, not forwards. They may have also felt some anxiety of influence. Ironically, the now famous Cady Stanton and other white feminists of the women's suffrage movement during Reconstruction and the Progressive Era are rightfully taken to task for racist attacks against Frederick Douglass and other black feminists of the period after the passage of the 15th Amendment without women's suffrage. By contrast, Crocker modeled inclusion, not exclusion, on matters of race, gender, class, and religion. She helped to found the School of Industry for poor girls in the North End with a group of women from various churches. She included women of all backgrounds in her history of Boston, including her friend, the poet Phyllis Wheatley. She condemned slavery in her 1813 sermon, A Humble Address, which she preserved in the American Antiquarian Society in manuscript form. She included the founding of the first black church of Boston in her history of the evolution of Christianity in the city. She was not free of prejudice, however. She never took her grandfather and great-grandfather, Cotton and Increase, to task for justifying the theology behind the Salem witch trials, even as she made fun of lingering superstitions of witches in 18th century Boston. She occasionally resorted to ethnic stereotypes, such as original inhabitant, to describe herself as one of the few true Bostonians left in the North End in the 1820s, as migrants and other minorities began to populate her home neighborhood. The interface of sexual, racial, and religious inequalities haunt Crocker's thought in subsequent iterations of American feminism. Returning to her observations is a chance to reflect on how feminism has haunted the ideas and politics of the American Republic from the start, and to think about why extraordinary women like Crocker still haunt the very margins of the feminist tradition that aims to make that republic live up to its principles of equality and liberty for each and all. A visible sign of her ghostly presence is our lack of any image of her, despite her gift of priceless portraits of her forefathers, Cotton and Increase, to the American Antiquarian Society and the Massachusetts Historical Society. So finally, the fifth reason why the book matters at 200 is its digitization by the Library of Congress in 2017. So the text was preserved on microfilm by the American Antiquarian Society in the late 20th century and made available digitally in the early part of this century via the Early American Imprint series, which is a wonderful resource. But if you're not part of a university with a great library, you probably don't have access to this. And so to have it digitized by the Library of Congress is really a tremendous a step forward in Crocker scholarship. I truly believe that there will be a generation of young feminist scholars who study this work in its context, in its rich political context, and make many discoveries simply because it is literally publicly accessible now. So thank you very much for that. Now, my good colleague, Constant Post, of the University of Iowa, published the first modern scholarly edition of the Observations in 2011, published with the University of Nebraska Press. And it's a wonderful resource, and it not only has the Observations, but also Crocker's other two major prose works, long essays that she published in Boston in the 1810s. It also has several of her sermons from the American Antiquarian Society, and it has selections from her Reminiscences and Traditions of Boston, which is the manuscript that I co-edited and published with the New England Historic Genealogical Society with Sarah Hauser in 2011. So this is a comprehensive scholarly edition of the manuscript that's held at the NEHGS in Boston. And this is her history of Boston. It's also very much a history of her family, but it's a comprehensive history of the city from the late 1620s through the late 1820s, when she died in 1829. We don't know what she intended to do with this manuscript, but there is some evidence within it that she intended to either publish it or give it to the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so either way, I think she would have been quite pleased that it finally made it to print. So with these resources, these scholarly resources, and the digitization of the observations on the Library of Congress website, I think we have the opportunity to push people to take Crocker seriously in American history going forward. I have on the screen the homepage of the Hannah Mather Crocker Society, which is a scholarly group I helped to found in 2013. You can see that we have a link to your copy of the observations on the homepage. We also have some other links to snippets of manuscripts that I became aware of initially in 2009. A anonymous owner of Crocker Family manuscripts contacted me by email. I still don't know the identity of the family, but I believe they're descendants of Crocker, probably through Joseph's line of the family. And they shared with me some images of manuscripts that I believe are authentic due to the handwriting. They have not shared with me the whole of their collection, although they promised me that when they were ready to share it with the public, I would be the first to be able to use it for scholarly purposes. I hope that is true. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for this moment. And if anyone has any advice how to deal with anonymous donors and get them to give you access to their papers, their priceless collection of historical data, I would love to hear any advice, because if I was granted permission to study this treasure trove of documents from the Crocker family's private collection, I believe I could make a serious contribution to knowledge regarding the religious, intellectual, cultural, and political origins of women's rights advocacy in the U.S. But I believe that's the missing piece. What we need is further manuscript evidence of her life and times to pull the pieces together, because there's still a few mysteries left. So the major mysteries I would like to solve are first the School of Industry for poor girls in the North End of Boston. I think this is a really remarkable organization. It's one of the first organizations of any sort founded by women in as far as I know, in at least Boston, if not the Northeast. And so it was a school founded for the assistance of poor girls by women from multiple religious backgrounds and churches. So I'd really like to get more insight into what actually was going on in the School of Industry, because it strikes me as actually quite radical from both, at least from a gender perspective and a class-based perspective, and I would love to know how racially diverse the group that they were serving was. I also want to learn more about St. Anne's Lodge, supposedly the first female Masonic lodge in the United States. And we know almost nothing beyond the few poems that are preserved in the reminiscences, which she also published in Boston newspapers in the late 18th century. But if I could crack the puzzle of St. Anne's Lodge, that would be amazing. As many of you may know, Masonry is a difficult subject to study because they're still quite secret. And so I've gotten to know some scholars of Masonry who tend to be Freemasons themselves. But I think if I could find manuscripts that shed light into the history of St. Anne's Lodge, that would probably make the Masonic scholarly community more open to collaborating with a non-Mason. So that's what I think we have left what we have left here is hopefully a raising of public awareness of Crocker so that more manuscripts will come to light and we'll be able to learn even more about this really important but unfortunately largely forgotten founding mother of the United States of America. Thank you.
So we certainly have time for questions. So.
What are the poems like?
Oh yeah.
Examples of them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Maybe I can. She had a lot of humor, so maybe I can pull out a poem that was humorous. One thing that she did is she preserved the poetry of other women. So in her History of Boston, she has a poem, a famous poem by Phyllis Wheatley, and she says that Phyllis Wheatley gave her a copy of it, and that she's copying down the poem from a manuscript that Phyllis Wheatley herself gave her. And of course, this in my fantasy world, this manuscript actually exists in this treasure chest. Right? So yeah, but she had a lot of respect for her fellow women poets, and she chronicled the many great women poets in the Boston area going back to the 17th century. Well, here's a funny one. It's called "On the Advantage of a Good Chimney." Okay. Would you your house from smoking free? You must erect a good chimney. Lay well your plan by line and square, so as to rarefy the air. By gentle crannies made complete, so as to send a pleasant heat into your parlor pure and clear, and keep the smoke out through the year. Then you, my friend, will coolly see the blessing of a good chimney. But she did lots of funny satirical verse, and some of the best stuff is the stuff that protests the War of 1812. There's some really great satirical verse, which I think is very much in the spirit of Jonathan Swift. And politically quite sharp, because what she's saying is that she's a taxpayer, she owns land, and she shouldn't have to pay taxes for not just war, which is an incredible, I mean, think about it. I mean, how can we possibly read her as just some sort of retrograde defender of the status quo? If she's writing poetry like that, right, and then literally giving it to the AAS or preserving it so that it can be given to the MHS. Right. I mean, clearly she wanted this stuff to be read. And she also circulated a lot of her poems. She gave a lot of her poems or mailed a lot of her poems to some of the leading male intellectuals of the time period. So William Jenks was a professor of theology at Bowdoin, and he also was a professor of Oriental languages. And they had a long correspondence about the School of Industry. He was very interested in her work as part of that school. But she also would just send him her political poetry in the mail. And so actually that's why we have a lot of those poems or copies of them, is he preserved them in his papers and they ended up in the MHS. Here's one on a more serious topic, and this is really early. This is 1773. So she's 21. So this is really one of her earliest poems. To a friend on the death of a child. 1773. Say, Delia, whence these cares arise, those anxious cares that rack your breast? If heaven is infinitely wise, what heaven appoints is just and best. 'Tis mercy, justice, truth divine, that mingles blessings with our cares. And shall our thankless hearts repine, if we obtain not all our prayers? And she signs it, Resignation by Eileen. So there's a this is a more humorous one, I suppose. and about death, but written in a more humorous vein. Lines in the Death of Her Favorite Cat by Hannah Mather Crocker. Awake my song, awake my muse, the noble theme I now must choose shall be poor Tabby's praise. Assist my muse, and you string my lyre, and touch my pen with ardent fire, to sing her worth and humble lays. Had I a pen well tipped with gold, her virtues I might just unfold. She was quite meek and harmless too, but faithful in her duties say. For she the rats and mice did slay, and did her duty faithful show. So you have the whole range. I mean, I think that on the face of it, we might say, oh, she was just kind of amateur writer of doggerel verse. But if you look back at the 18th century and by how many intellectuals of the time period wrote verse and then published it, often under pseudonyms, you have to remember that poetry just performed a political function that it doesn't for us now necessarily. And so for her to be writing poems, circulating them in manuscript, publishing them in newspapers, under a pseudonym. I mean, compare it with the Federalist Papers, also published under a pseudonym, right? I mean, I think we need to see the value of these poems in their political context and understand that, especially for a woman writer, much of what she was doing had many levels of significance, personal, social, political, and so on.
It seems like she talked a lot about woman, wife, and helpmeet.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if single women were on her radar at all.
Yeah.
Just beyond the
Well, that's a great question. It's great. So in The Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, which she read and cites several times in the observations, Wollstonecraft does single out single women, and she does argue for a single woman's right to live a life with dignity. And I think that's really one of the most powerful moments in a Vindication of the Rights of Women, because it's not, a lot of times Wollstonecraft even gets typecast as a kind of conservative defender of marriage and, so on. And I think that really misses the mark, because Wollstonecraft certainly defends marriage when it's practiced as an egalitarian friendship, but she also defends women's right to be single and to live that life with dignity. Crocker is similar in this sense. Now, she certainly upholds marriage as her model social relationship. So does Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft says marriage is the most holy band of friendship in society. And Crocker says just about the same in the observations. So it's her ideal model relationship, right? For everything, including politics, including the republic itself. Everything should function ideally the way a good marriage functions, if a marriage is functioning as a friendship. That said, she herself was a widow for most of her life, right? Right. Okay. And she raised most of those kids herself. So 7 of them live into adulthood. And Joseph Crocker is dead by, I think he dies in 1797, right? So when she's giving papers and books from the Mather Family Library and the artworks from the Mather Family Collection to the MHS in 1798, she's doing that as a widow, right? So many of her boldest political acts, her boldest public acts come when she's a widow. And then all of her published writings come when she's that's not. All of her major published writings come when she's a widow. She published some poems when she was married, and she was obviously active in founding the St. Anne's Lodge, which he supported through signing the North Square Creed. But she lived most of her life as a widow, as a single mother, you could say, supporting that family and her grandchildren. And so I think that she used many of her pseudonyms accentuated her identity as a widow. The widow Pigsley was one I mentioned earlier. So I think it's implicit across her body of work that being a single woman or being a widow is a legitimate way of life for a woman, and ought to be respected and supported in a free federal republic. I'd have to go back and look at the text of the observations, though, to see when she flags single women who are not widows. Yes, that I can't recall off the top of my head. When she talks about the right of women to be single, prior to marriage, or to not enter marriage at all. But I think the fact that she understands marriage as a friendship and as a union you enter into freely and with love means that she has to vindicate women's right to be single, because marriage, if it is a friendship, could never be forced.
Many times people that have manuscripts don't want them published because it affects the value. So you may want to find a benefactor.
Right, not a benefactor, yeah.
Who could help you to talk with this anonymous source.
Right.
That maybe there is some way of shaking those manuscripts.
Oh, that's interesting. So find a benefactor.
Find the money first.
Find the money first. That's interesting. Okay. It should be possible at Notre Dame.
It should be. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay, that's good advice. I mean, when they wrote to me, I did say, I think Notre Dame would be very interested in preserving these in their special collections library. But they said they just weren't ready to part with them. They were preserving it. And so I buy your intuition here that it's about family attachment to the documents themselves, right? And that they have to get to a point where they're ready to part with them. Right.
But if you can convince them that financially, you're prepared, or the institution is prepared to have them evaluated and so forth. It, over time, it may help them make a decision. So if you're ready.
Yes, please.
I don't know the naming traditions of that period. How common was it for a woman to use her birth name?
Yeah, right.
And did she do that all her life?
Yeah.
Or only when she became a widow?
Well, you can see that's one of her signatures, and she often went by H.M. Crocker. Let me go back to the.
Right.
Yeah, and here when she published it, it was H. Mather. She also used HMC a lot in her reminiscences. She loved that, but she almost always included the M. She was very proud of Una Mather. Her maiden name mattered a lot to her, and she understood herself as part of the fivefold line of Mather, and I think she understood herself as a kind of the female heir of that grand Puritan theological tradition. It went back to Richard Mather, I think she was the heir of the Mather family library, and then donated most of that to the American Antiquarian Society in 1814-15. And so she, I think, always accentuated the Mather or the M because she wanted to remind people that she was the female heir of this grand patriarchal tradition, right? And in some ways what she's doing is she's taking it and making it into a feminist one. She's showing that their Christian principles are compatible with modern ideas of women's rights that were arising from the Revolutionary period. There was no conflict in principle between being a Christian, right, in that what her father would have called an old light sense, a kind of that old rationalist Puritan sense of Christianity of the 17th century, and espousing the revolutionary ideals, including women's rights.
Yet she's light years away from Cotton.
Oh yes, yeah. But on the other hand, what she has more in common with Cotton and her father Samuel is their rationalism. I mean that and that the Great Awakening brought evangelicalism to Boston, And that never sat well with the Mathers. They weren't evangelicals. And that's why there was the break between the Second Church of Boston and the Mather Meeting House. So her father literally goes to found a new church because he's an old light rationalist, you know. And so he in many ways is much more in tune, you know, with increase in cotton than he is with his peer group. And I think that's why in the end Crocker became very interested in the rise of universalism, Unitarianism from within the Unitarian Church of Boston. Because, you know, she was herself not a Unitarian, but what she had in common with the Unitarians and the Universalists was rationalism. And I think that's why you see all those old Boston, you know, Congregationalist churches basically turn Unitarian functionally by the early 19th century.
I have a question about, so you made a really good case about why she would be considered a feminist Republican, you know, and this idea of civic duty and virtue being, you know, equal between men and women. But the question and going back to how you started your talk with Roger Smith, and Rogers, you know, says that it's not just republicanism, it's also liberalism, and then he has this other term, descriptive hierarchies. So I want to ask you about liberalism. So there wasn't a lot of liberalism in your talk, but this is the real rights of women and appropriate duties. The duties, yes, okay, that's the republicanism, but what about the rights? And what rights was she advocating for? And did they include voting? Did they include things that we would consider to be liberal functions?
Sure. Like other women's rights advocates of the late 18th and early 19th century, she didn't go straight to suffrage. Even Mary Wollstonecraft doesn't go straight to suffrage. I mean, there's the famous moment in the Vindication of the Rights of Women, chapter 9, where she says, you might laugh at me if I say that women should have the same right to be represented and to have representatives as men. And she flags the debate about whether working class men period should be able to vote or not. But she kind of frames it as a kind of joke of sorts, or she anticipates the laughter of her audience. And there's even a debate in the Wollstonecraft scholarship, believe it or not, where some scholars will actually resist the notion that Wollstonecraft really advocated for women's right to vote. I think that's going way too far. It's clear from the Vindication of the Rights of Women, even just the preface and the introduction. Wollstonecraft wants men and women to have equal civil and political rights, period. Right, that includes voting. And so it even includes being representatives themselves, right, running for office. Right. That said, Wollstonecraft was a little cagey in the way she represented that issue of suffrage. And Crocker is no different. We don't get any explicit defense of women's right to suffrage in the observations. But as far as I can tell, nobody in the American tradition, not a single writer prior to 1846, I believe, Samuel May was actually an owner of a copy of the Observations, which is now held in the Boston Athenaeum. And he wrote an essay on the rights and condition of women, published in New York, upstate New York, in 1846. The library has a copy of that. That book has some theological arguments about the rights of women, which I think are roughly comparable to the Observations. Now, I could never say, was there a direct influence of Crocker's observations on Samuel May's, book on the right of women to suffrage. But I think the fact that he owned a copy of the Observations and he made similar theological arguments suggests that he was probably influenced by her. While she herself did not argue for women's suffrage, which I guess we would understand as the classic liberal right? She certainly had influence on those who went on to make those arguments. Now, let's think about other famous American feminists from the early 19th century, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. Their letters on the equality of the sexes from the late 1830s, also published in Boston. they don't explicitly argue women's right to vote at that time. They go on to become advocates, but it's 1840s is a real turning point in American women's rights advocacy. That's when you start to see explicit defenses of a right to vote. Now, there are other liberal rights, or rights that we associate with the liberal tradition. Free speech, association, tolerance, freedom of religious expression. All of those things can be found in Crocker's observations and across her body of work, for sure. For sure, all of those are there. Now, the reason I framed her as a feminist Republican is that it's because of this deontological conception of rights and duties. That duties are the basis for rights. Right. Every right emerges from a corresponding duty, and that is a more Republican way of framing it. And so instead of starting from rights, we start from duties. My own view, perhaps a slightly a tension with our wonderful professor Roger Smith, is more in line with Judith Sklar, who in her work always emphasized the way that modern liberalism emerged from 18th century republicanism, so both in Europe and the US. And so we can't really separate out liberalism and republicanism. Historically, they emerge from one another, right? So liberalism in many ways grows out of 18th century conceptions and practices of republicanism. And she really flagged the American case as being hugely influential on the liberal tradition going forward. So I really read both Crocker and Wollstonecraft as 18th century, in Crocker's case, early 19th century Republican feminists or feminist Republicans whose ideas resonate with liberalism going forward because republicanism in general was such an important source for liberalism.
Does she discuss as to why she writes this? One question. And then the second question, did she also have interaction with single property women of other states? So for example, in New Jersey, it's been a while since I've looked at that, but there was a period of time where women, single property women, did have the right to vote.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Women could vote in New Jersey until about, I think it's about 1800. It might be a little bit later, it might be like 1803 or something, but it's about 1800. And it was because their constitution, their state constitution didn't specify the gender. So it was a classic legal loophole. So women would go vote. And then it was shut down during the beginning of the Napoleonic era as things became more repressive with regard to women's rights during the Adams administration. Ironically, given that Abigail Adams, was who she was. Her husband wasn't as supportive. How much contact did she have with women from other states? There's not a lot of evidence, although she did have some correspondence with people from Philadelphia that's preserved in her reminiscences. She spent her whole life in Boston, and she just a few times records going out, even into what we now call the suburbs. She went out to Plymouth once. She went out to Worcester once. She was a true Boston girl, and she really devoted her whole life to the city and then chronicling its history. But certainly, her history of Boston shows her awareness of women's agency in every sector of society, including economic agency and religious agency, so on. But I'll have to look. Oh, and she also she did talk about women traveling in the colonial period, some of the women that she chronicles are those that were very bold in their travels during the colonial era, often at great personal risk. So she certainly was interested in this question of chronicling and representing women's agency, especially in roles that her into the public. She really despised that war. And so much of her literary work was devoted to protesting that war. So I think that kind of got her more into the public light. She, at the same time, she got involved in founding the school. And then she published her 3 major prose works, the series of letters on Freemasonry in 1815, the School of Reform in 1816, and then the Observations in 1818. And during this period, she's beginning to collect the poetry that would then be put in the Reminiscences. And in the 1820s, she writes the Reminiscences between 1822 and 1829. Now, traditionally, scholarship has emphasized that Crocker waits until her husband is dead before she publishes her major writings. Well, this is true. It ignores 2 critical facts. One is that she did publish in Boston newspapers while she was married, and then in her Reminiscences, she's preserving poems that she wrote prior to her marriage. And then it also ignores the fact that Joseph Crocker had been dead quite some time before she went out and published her first major prose works in the 1810s. He dies in the 1790s. So it can't simply be his death that precipitates her to go out and write. That's not right. I mean, it's not as though she was in some sort of repressive marriage, in which she didn't feel comfortable publishing or writing. That wasn't the case at all. I think it really was the political atmosphere of the war of 1812 that really kind of catalyzed her as a public actor. And that I find very inspirational, honestly. When I was writing the piece on her political oratory for the Journal of Politics, it was in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and I have to say that reading her protest of the war of 1812 resonated very strongly with me, and also in thinking about contemporary feminist protest of the war more broadly.
So she was financially stable after.
Well, okay, so that's a great question. She did inherit most of her wealth through her mother's side of the family, the Hutchinsons. The Mathers had a lot of books and a lot of art. The Hutchinsons had real estate, and I think that's how she maintained herself. She rented rooms. There were ads in Boston newspapers that show she rented a room to a doctor for some time. She had multiple homes. She gave a home to one of her brothers who was disowned because he was loyalist. And then she gives him a house so he can come back to Boston, which I think shows the ways in which she never really forsook ties to the loyal side of the family. She always maintained a strong affection, even as she politically was always a patriot. So yeah, it was her mother's real estate that kept her going. And then she sold a lot of the Mather books, and she made some money on that. Isaiah Thomas was the founder of the American Antiquarian Society, and he was a pretty shrewd operator. I think he knew she had a treasure trove, and he did kind of move in. But I also think that she was quite shrewd too, and she sold that off in portions over quite a bit of time. So she knew she had something of value, and she dragged it out as long as she could and used it as a kind of resource for her family over time. But there was a moment in the late 1810s, after she published the Observations, where she actually applied for some charity from a veterans association as a widow of a Revolutionary War veteran. So she's always complaining in her poetry how her house is falling apart. It always needs repair. Yeah. It was colonial era, so yeah.
I think probably for the sake of time and getting everybody back to their office before 5, we should go ahead and shut this down. But thank you so much.